In 1853, a daguerreotype photograph was taken at a prosperous plantation in rural South Carolina. The image showed a young white woman, visibly obese, seated in an ornate chair, surrounded by 4 enslaved people standing motionless with empty gazes fixed on the camera. For decades, the photograph remained stored in a family trunk, considered just another portrait from the antebellum era. But when state archivists digitized forgotten birth records in 2019, a disturbing discovery emerged. Between 1854 and 1860, 7 children were born at the plantation, all registered with the same white mother, the obese young woman from the photograph, but with no father identified in official documents. The silence in the records was deafening. No marriage certificate, no mention of a husband, only successive births year after year, while the plantation prospered under the administration of the widow, the young woman's mother. Local parish records mentioned private baptisms performed at midnight without community witnesses. Nearby neighbors reported in preserved letters that strange things happened on that property, but no one dared question a family of such prestige and political influence. The absence of documentation about the children's fate became even more sinister when researchers discovered that after 1860, birth records simply ceased. The same year, 3 of the enslaved people depicted in the photograph disappeared from property inventories. There are no records of sale, escape, or death. They simply ceased to exist on paper, erased from official history as if they had never lived. For over 150 years, the truth remained buried in dusty court archives, in coded diaries discovered in false walls, and in the whispers of descendants who carried fragments of a story never publicly told. What really happened at that plantation? Why did an unmarried young woman repeatedly give birth without ever revealing the father's identities? And where did the children go? And the enslaved people who disappeared without a trace? The 1853 photograph holds secrets that Southern society preferred to bury. But the birth records revealed everything. Before continuing, subscribe and activate the bell. Here we unearth secrets buried by official history and give voice to what was silenced. Chapter 1. The Forgotten Photograph. 850-950 words. The discovery happened by chance, like so many disturbing historical revelations. In March 2019, a document restorer at the South Carolina Historical Society opened a rusted metal box that had remained forgotten in county archives for decades. Inside, protected by a worn velvet cloth, was an 1853 daguerreotype photograph, one of the first photographic images produced in the American South. The copper plate, though stained by time, preserved with disturbing clarity a scene that would become the center of one of the darkest historical investigations into American slavery. The image showed a young white woman, no more than 20 years old, seated in an elaborate mahogany chair with gold details. Her dark silk dress extended in voluminous layers around her visibly obese body, a symbol of wealth in an era when only the upper classes could afford to eat abundantly. Her chubby face remained expressionless, eyes fixed directly on the lens, without a trace of smile or emotion. Her fat hands rested on her lap, covered by immaculate white gloves. But it was not the young lady that made the photograph extraordinary. It was the 4 figures surrounding her. 2 men and 2 women, all black, stood in rigid positions around the chair. Their clothing was simple but clean, coarse cotton tunics and patched trousers. Their faces displayed the unmistakable mark of slavery: empty stares, curved shoulders, total absence of any personal expression. There were no names written on the back of the photograph, only a notation in faded ink: Hartwell property, 1853, Margaret with her servants. For weeks, the restorer tried to identify who Margaret Hartwell was. Census records from 1850 revealed that Hartwell property was one of the county's most prosperous plantations, with over 200 acres of cultivable land and 37 enslaved people. The official owner was Constance Hartwell, a 53-year-old widow who had assumed administration after her husband's sudden death in 1848. Margaret was her only daughter, born in 1833, unmarried, with no record of marriage or engagement in parish archives. The photograph would have remained just another historical curiosity, if not for an extraordinary coincidence. In the same month of discovery, another archivist was working on digitizing county birth records, documents that had never been properly cataloged and remained stored in damp basements of old courthouses. Among piles of yellowed paper stained by decades of neglect, he found a series of certificates that immediately caught his attention. Between 1854 and 1860, 7 children were born at Hartwell property. All 7 certificates listed the same mother, Margaret Hartwell, but in each one, the field reserved for the father's name was blank. There were no marks, erasures, or indications that any name had been registered and later erased. Just an empty space, deliberate, as if the information should never be documented. The first birth occurred in April 1854, exactly 9 months after the date the photograph was taken. A girl registered only as child of Margaret H. The second birth came in November 1855. The third in February 1857. The intervals were irregular, but the sequence was undeniable. Year after year, Margaret Hartwell, an unmarried woman who never officially married, gave birth to children whose fathers were never identified in public records. When the 2 archivists compared their findings, the 1853 photograph and the birth records, an inevitable question arose. Who were the fathers of these children? And why would a family of such prestige and influence allow their unmarried daughter to repeatedly give birth without ever revealing the identity of the men involved? Parish records from the period offered even more disturbing clues. The local reverend, who kept a meticulous diary of all baptisms and ceremonies performed in the community, made strange notations about Hartwell property. In July 1854, he wrote, "Private baptism performed at midnight at the Hartwell residence. Child presented by Mrs. Constance. No member of the congregation was invited to witness. I received generous payment to maintain absolute discretion." Other entries followed the same pattern. Baptisms performed in secret, always at night, always without external witnesses. The Reverend never mentioned the children's names in his public notations, only in private codes he kept in a separate notebook. A notebook only discovered when his old residence was demolished in 1987 and found inside a false wall. The local community also maintained deliberate silence about the Hartwells. Preserved letters from neighboring farmers made veiled references to inappropriate situations and matters that should not be discussed in decent society. One particularly revealing letter, written by a local high society lady to her sister in Charleston, mentioned, "Young Hartwell continues increasing in size, and we all know what that means. But no one dares question Constance, who has too much influence over the local sheriff and judge." The silence was not just social, it was institutional. The Hartwell family possessed deep connections with local authorities. Constance was sister to the county's attorney general, and her family had financed the construction of the new courthouse in 1849. Any investigation into their private activities would be quickly stifled before it could even begin. But the most disturbing aspect of the 1853 photograph was yet to be revealed. When researchers cross-referenced property records with inventories of enslaved people maintained by the plantation, they discovered something that would completely transform understanding of the case. The 4 people depicted in the photograph alongside Margaret, those anonymous servants, had names in the farm's internal records, and between 1854 and 1860, as Margaret's children were born, 3 of these 4 people completely disappeared from the inventories. There are no records of sale. There are no death certificates. There are no documents of escape or capture. They simply ceased to exist. Chapter 2. The Widow and the Hidden Empire, 850-950 words. To understand what happened at Hartwell property, it was first necessary to understand who Constance Hartwell was, the matriarch who controlled every aspect of that isolated agricultural empire. Born Constance Pemberton in 1797, she grew up in one of South Carolina's oldest and most respected families, a direct descendant of English colonists who had received land grants from the Crown in the previous century. Her education was exceptional by the standards of the time. She spoke French fluently, played piano, and possessed accounting and administrative knowledge that surpassed that of many men of her generation. In 1820, at 23 years old, Constance married Thomas Hartwell, a wealthy cotton merchant 15 years her senior. The marriage was strategic. It united 2 considerable fortunes and consolidated the family's political power in the region. Thomas brought capital and commercial connections with northern ports. Constance brought extensive lands and enslaved labor inherited from her father. Together they transformed Hartwell property into one of the county's most profitable agricultural operations. Margaret was born in 1833, the couple's only child to survive beyond infancy. Preserved medical records indicate that Constance suffered multiple miscarriages and lost 2 children in early childhood, common tragedies in an era of precarious medicine and inadequate sanitary conditions. Margaret therefore became the sole heir to the entire Hartwell fortune. Raised in almost complete isolation at the plantation, educated by private tutors, and rarely seen at community social events. Neighbors who left written accounts about the family described Margaret as a peculiar and extremely reserved young woman. A letter from 1850, written by a distant cousin who visited the property, mentioned, "Little Margaret barely speaks when questioned. She spends entire days in her chambers, eating imported sweets and reading French novels. Constance keeps her away from any contact with unmarried young men in the region, claiming none of them possess adequate education for her daughter." Thomas Hartwell died suddenly in March 1848 at 63 years old. The official recorded cause was brain fever, a vague term used at the time to describe any sudden neurological condition, but strange circumstances surrounded his death. The local physician who signed the death certificate left a cryptic note in his private journal, discovered only in 1976 when his descendants donated his papers to a medical school. Called to Hartwell property at dawn. Thomas already deceased when I arrived. Constance insisted on immediate burial before proper examination. Paid triple my usual fee for expedited certificate. Something profoundly wrong in that house. Thomas was buried within 24 hours in the private family cemetery on the plantation grounds. Unusual haste even for that era, when bodies were typically displayed for several days, to allow family and community to pay respects. No public funeral was held. No obituary appeared in local newspapers. The county's wealthiest cotton merchant simply vanished from public life overnight, replaced by his widow who immediately assumed complete control of all business operations. What happened next defied all social conventions of the antebellum South. Widows of wealthy planters were expected to remarry quickly or transfer property management to male relatives. Instead, Constance not only maintained control, but expanded the plantation's operations significantly. Within 2 years of Thomas's death, she had acquired 3 adjacent properties, increasing the total acreage to over 500 and the number of enslaved people to 73. Her business acumen was extraordinary. Shipping manifests preserved in Charleston port archives show that Hartwell cotton commanded premium prices throughout the 1850s, often 15 to 20% higher than competing plantations. Constance negotiated directly with northern textile mills, bypassing traditional intermediaries and keeping a larger share of profits. She invested in new cotton gin technology and implemented crop rotation methods that maintained soil fertility better than neighboring farms. But there was a darker side to Constance's efficiency. Plantation ledgers discovered in an attic trunk in 1963 revealed a meticulous system of control over the enslaved population that went far beyond typical oversight. Every person was tracked not just by name and labor assignment, but by detailed physical characteristics, family relationships, and what Constance referred to in her notes as breeding potential. The ledgers contained columns with disturbing headings: suitable for reproduction, physical strength assessment, temperament for household service, and most chillingly, special assignments, main house. 4 names appeared repeatedly under this last category between 1850 and 1853. Samuel, age 28, described as excellent physique, compliant nature; Joshua, age 31, strong constitution, literate; Rebecca, age 24, healthy childbearing history; and Martha, age 26, docile, suitable for intimate service. These were the 4 people who would appear in the 1853 photograph standing around Margaret. Constance's obsession with documenting and controlling reproduction among the enslaved was not unique to Hartwell property. Many slaveholders practiced systematic forced breeding to increase their human property without purchasing new people. But the level of detail in Constance's record suggested something beyond typical plantation management. She tracked menstrual cycles, noted successful pregnancies, and maintained separate records of children born to enslaved mothers, records that were carefully hidden in a locked iron box, distinct from the standard plantation ledgers shown to overseers and occasional visitors. What made the Hartwell operation particularly sinister was its isolation. The plantation was situated 7 miles from the nearest town, accessible only by a long, tree-lined road that allowed anyone at the main house to see approaching visitors from a considerable distance. The enslaved population lived in quarters deliberately positioned on the far side of the property, separated from the main house by dense woods and a creek that flooded during heavy rains, making unauthorized movement difficult. Local merchants who delivered supplies to the plantation reported an atmosphere of fear and unusual silence. One merchant wrote in a letter to his brother in 1852, "The Negroes at Hartwell work in complete quiet. I've never heard singing or conversation among them, as is common at other farms. They move like shadows, heads down, never making eye contact. Even the children seem afraid to play. Mrs. Hartwell watches everything from her upper window, and I swear I've never felt such a cold presence in my life. The main house itself was architecturally designed for maximum surveillance, built in the Georgian style with modifications Constance commissioned after Thomas's death. It featured a distinctive octagonal tower room on the 3rd floor, with windows offering views of the entire property. Servants who worked in neighboring plantations and occasionally interacted with Hartwell workers whispered that Constance spent hours each day in that tower, watching through a brass telescope she had imported from England. By 1853, when the daguerreotype photograph was taken, Constance had transformed Hartwell property into a completely self-contained world. She employed no white overseers, unusual for a plantation of that size. She handled all business correspondence personally, never allowing visitors into private areas of the house. She appeared in church only for major holidays, always arriving after services began and leaving before they concluded, avoiding extended social interaction. And Margaret, now 20 years old, had become something other than a typical Southern belle awaiting marriage. She was massive, her obesity the result of years of isolation and unlimited access to rich foods. She rarely left her chambers on the 2nd floor of the main house, and according to fragmentary diary entries discovered decades later, she lived in absolute terror of her mother. Chapter 3. The Four Who Stood Beside Her. 850-950 words. The identities of the 4 enslaved people in the 1853 photograph remained unknown for over a century and a half, just nameless faces frozen in time, their individual histories erased by the deliberate silence of official records. But patient research by genealogists and historians beginning in 2019 gradually reconstructed fragments of their lives, piecing together a narrative from plantation ledgers, sale documents from earlier owners, and oral histories passed down through generations of their descendants. Samuel was born in 1825 on a tobacco plantation in Virginia. His original enslaver's estate records describe him as exceptionally tall, strong build, quick learner. He was taught to read by the enslaver's elderly mother, who defied local laws by conducting secret lessons for selected house servants. This literacy would later be noted in Hartwell ledgers as both an asset and a potential danger. Enslaved people who could read were valuable for certain tasks, but also posed greater risks of forging travel passes or reading abolitionist materials. Samuel was sold south in 1847, part of a group of 23 people purchased by Thomas Hartwell at a Richmond auction. The sale document listed him at age 22, valued at $1,200, a premium price reflecting his physical strength and skills. He arrived at Hartwell property in chains, transported by wagon over 2 weeks of brutal travel. Within months, Thomas Hartwell assigned him to work in the main house rather than the fields, a position that seemed privileged, but carried its own particular horrors. Joshua's history was even more fragmented. He appeared in Hartwell records in 1849, purchased from a neighboring plantation whose owner had died heavily in debt. The bill of sale noted his age as approximately 29 and described him as field hand, carpenter skills, reliable. But there were gaps in his documented past, years unaccounted for that suggested he may have been moved between multiple owners. His personal history deliberately obscured to prevent any connection to family members or previous locations. Plantation ledgers revealed that Joshua possessed rare skills in carpentry and metalwork. He built furniture for the main house, repaired tools, and constructed the iron bars that Constance had installed on certain windows after Thomas's death. His literacy was noted in Constance's private records. Can read measurements and follow written instructions. Useful for complex projects. Must monitor carefully. Rebecca came to Hartwell property under circumstances that remained unclear even to researchers. She first appeared in inventory records in 1850, age 22, listed as house servant, experienced with fine textiles and laundry, but there was no purchase document, no bill of sale, no transfer papers from another plantation. She simply materialized in the records as if she had always been there, her past deliberately erased or hidden. Oral histories passed down through descendants suggested Rebecca may have been born free in Charleston, daughter of a freed woman and an unknown white man. According to these accounts, she was kidnapped at age 16 by slave catchers who forged papers claiming she was escaped property. Such kidnappings were common. Free black people, especially those with light skin who might have been born to white fathers, were valuable targets for criminals who could sell them into slavery with falsified documentation. If the oral histories were accurate, Rebecca's presence at Hartwell property represented a particularly cruel injustice. She had known freedom, education, and family, all stripped away by violence and forgery. Her literacy was noted in Hartwell records with unusual emphasis. Reads and writes with exceptional ability, French language skills, musical training, suitable only for main house service under direct supervision. Martha's documented history began in 1848, when she was purchased by Constance Hartwell from an estate sale in Georgia. She was 24 years old, described in sale documents as healthy breeding female, 2 successful births, compliant disposition. The phrase successful births was brutal code. Her children had survived past infancy, making her valuable for producing more enslaved people. But those children were not mentioned in transfer documents. They remained in Georgia when Martha was sold south, torn from her forever in a separation so routine it required no special notation. Hartwell ledgers tracked Martha's life at the plantation with clinical detail. Constance noted her menstrual cycles, her physical health, her emotional state. When Martha fell ill in 1849, Constance personally supervised her recovery, not out of compassion but from concern about protecting valuable property. A ledger entry from that time coldly stated, "Martha restored to health, suitable for breeding assignments to resume." These 4 people, Samuel, Joshua, Rebecca, and Martha, were brought together in the main house of Hartwell property between 1850 and 1853. They were not field workers. They did not labor in cotton rows under the burning sun. Instead, they were confined to the interior spaces of that Georgian mansion, performing household tasks under Constance's constant surveillance. They served meals, cleaned chambers, maintained gardens, and carried out repairs. And they existed in a state of captivity, even more suffocating than field slavery, because their lives intersected directly with the darkest secrets of the Hartwell family. The photograph from 1853 captured them in a moment of forced performance, standing motionless around Margaret, arranged like decorative objects, their humanity erased by the very act of being photographed as property. Their faces revealed nothing. Their eyes stared forward with practiced blankness. But researchers who examined high-resolution scans of the daguerreotype in 2020 noticed something subtle. Martha's right hand, partially visible at the edge of the frame, showed scarring consistent with deliberate burns, the kind inflicted as punishment or warning. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're hearing this story. I want to know how far these silenced accounts reach. Chapter 4. 7 Children Without Fathers, 850-950 words. The birth certificate discovered in April 2019 was stained with water damage and nearly illegible in places, but the essential information survived. On April 19, 1854, a female child was born to Margaret Hartwell at Hartwell property. The attending physician was listed as Dr. Edmund Price, who practiced in a town 12 miles away. The father's name field remained blank, not scratched out, not marked with unknown or deceased, but simply empty, as if the question was irrelevant. This first child would be followed by 6 others over the next 6 years, each birth following the same pattern. The certificates accumulated in a folder that county clerks apparently found too delicate to process normally, filed separately from standard vital records, and eventually forgotten in a basement storage room where they remained undisturbed for over a century and a half. Researchers attempting to trace what happened to these children faced immediate obstacles. Unlike typical birth records of the period, which at least provided first names for infants, these certificates listed the children only as "Child of Margaret H." or "Female infant born to Ems Hartwell." No names, no subsequent baptism records in the public parish registry, no notations in family Bibles or cemetery records. 7 children born to one of the wealthiest families in the county, and yet they seemed to vanish immediately after birth, leaving no trace in the historical record. The only evidence of their existence came from Dr. Edmund Price's private medical journal, donated to a medical school by his great-grandson in 1982. The journal had been cataloged but never thoroughly examined until historians began investigating the Hartwell case in 2019. What they found was extraordinary. Detailed entries describing 7 midnight summons to Hartwell property over a 6-year period, each visit resulting in the delivery of a child to Margaret Hartwell. Dr. Price's first entry was dated April 18, 1854, Summoned to Hartwell property at 11 in the evening by urgent message. Arrived past midnight to find Miss Margaret in advanced labor. Birth completed by dawn. Healthy female infant delivered. Mrs. Constance insisted on immediate baptism by Reverend Wells, who arrived before I had even cleaned the child. Both mother and child removed to separate chambers before I could complete standard post-birth examination. Payment received, 10 times my normal fee, with explicit instructions to register birth but maintain absolute discretion regarding circumstances. I complied, though conscience troubles me. Subsequent entries followed similar patterns, but revealed increasing unease. In November 1855, after delivering Margaret's second child, Dr. Price wrote, "Miss Margaret appears severely weakened by repeated childbirth. Her obesity complicates delivery and recovery. I recommended against future pregnancies, but Mrs. Constance dismissed my medical advice with cold fury. The house slaves who assisted the birth were immediately removed from my sight. I was not permitted to give them post-delivery instructions for the mother's care. Something deeply wrong occurs in this house, but I am powerless to intervene and cannot risk losing the substantial payments that support my practice." By the third birth in February 1857, Dr. Price's entries contained barely concealed horror. Miss Margaret wept throughout the entire labor and delivery. She begged me to help her escape, but before I could respond, Mrs. Constance entered the chamber and silenced her daughter with a look of such cold authority that the young woman went completely quiet. The child was taken away before Miss Margaret could even hold it. I was paid and dismissed before completing my duties. I fear I am complicit in something monstrous, yet I cannot speak publicly without destroying my practice and reputation. God forgive me for my cowardice. The timing of the births was not random. By calculating backward 9 months from each delivery, researchers determined that the conceptions likely occurred during specific periods when Constance Hartwell made extended trips away from the plantation. Estate records and correspondence showed that Constance traveled to Charleston 3 to 4 times per year to conduct business, manage investments, and meet with lawyers. These trips typically lasted 2 to 3 weeks, and it was during these absences that Margaret apparently became pregnant. But who was the father, or fathers, of these children? The question haunted researchers. Initially, speculation focused on the possibility of secret relationships with white men from neighboring plantations or traveling merchants, but investigation revealed serious problems with this theory. Hartwell property was extraordinarily isolated, and Margaret was known to never leave the estate grounds. No regular visitors came to the main house except Dr. Price for deliveries and Reverend Wells for clandestine baptisms. The few merchants who delivered supplies never entered the residence itself. The alternative explanation was almost too horrifying to contemplate, yet the evidence gradually pointed in only one direction. The fathers of Margaret's children were among the enslaved men held at the plantation. And given the photographic evidence showing Margaret specifically posed with Samuel and Joshua in 1853, just months before her first pregnancy, these 2 men became the prime suspects in what amounted to systematic abuse, enabled by Constance's deliberate absences. But the term fathers implied choice and agency that certainly did not exist. Samuel and Joshua were enslaved men with no ability to refuse demands from their captors. Whatever occurred during Constance's trips to Charleston, it happened under coercion, in a context where enslaved people possessed no legal rights and no means of escape. The historical record was clear. What happened to Samuel and Joshua was not consensual in any meaningful sense. They were victims, not perpetrators, regardless of the biological relationship to the children. The question that researchers struggled to answer was whether Constance orchestrated these pregnancies deliberately, or whether they resulted from actions Margaret took during her mother's absence. Did Constance create a situation where her isolated, emotionally damaged daughter would become involved with enslaved men, knowing she could control the consequences? Or did Margaret, in some desperate attempt at connection or rebellion, initiate relationships during the rare moments she was not under her mother's direct surveillance? Dr. Price's journal provided one crucial clue. In an entry from 1858, after delivering Margaret's 5th child, he wrote, "Miss Margaret was more coherent this time, though still deeply distressed. She spoke of being forced to choose and punished for resistance. I could make no sense of her words, but they suggested something beyond simple indiscretion." Mrs. Constance arrived and immediately administered laudanum to quiet her daughter. I departed quickly, unwilling to witness more. The phrase "forced to choose" was haunting. It suggested Margaret was not simply left unsupervised during her mother's absences, but was presented with some kind of coerced decision. The true nature of what happened at Hartwell property during those periods remained locked in silence, known only to those who lived through it and took the truth to unmarked graves. What became undeniable was that 7 children were born into impossible circumstances, offspring of an obese white woman who never married and never left her family's plantation, conceived during her widowed mother's calculated absences, and then erased from all records as if they had never existed at all. Chapter 5. The Private Baptisms, 850-950 words. Reverend Josiah Wells arrived at Hartwell property for the first time on April 20, 1854, the day after Margaret's first child was born. He came not in daylight, as would be customary for a joyous baptism celebrating a new life, but under cover of darkness, summoned by a messenger who appeared at his door near midnight with a sealed letter and a leather purse containing more money than the Reverend typically earned in 3 months. Reverend Wells kept meticulous records of his ministry, including private observations he never intended for public view. These journals were preserved by his family and eventually donated to a theological seminary in 1931, where they sat unexamined until historians began investigating the Hartwell case. What the journals revealed about the baptisms at Hartwell property was deeply disturbing, a portrait of a man of faith who recognized he was participating in something profoundly wrong, but lacked the courage to refuse. His first journal entry about Hartwell, dated April 21, 1854, began with unusual defensiveness. "I am not proud of what I witnessed last night, but I tell myself I served God's purpose by ensuring the infant received Christian baptism. The child was healthy, though I was not permitted to hold her for more than the brief moment required for the sacrament. Mrs. Constance Hartwell supervised everything with an authority I have never seen in a woman. She dictated exact words I was to use, insisted the ceremony be completed before dawn, and made clear that no record should appear in the parish registry. The Reverend noted that he was paid an extraordinary sum for what amounted to less than an hour of work. The payment troubled him enough that he felt compelled to justify it in his journal. Perhaps God intends this money to support my ministry to the poor of our community. I will donate a portion to the Widows' Fund and consider my conscience eased." But his conscience was not eased. Over the next 6 years, as Reverend Wells was summoned 6 more times to baptize Margaret's subsequent children, his journal entries became increasingly anguished. After the second baptism in November 1855, he wrote, "I pray I am not aiding in some terrible sin." The young Miss Hartwell appeared deathly pale and refused to look at the child. Her mother held the infant throughout, and I noticed the child was dressed in the finest white lace, clearly expensive garments prepared in advance, as if the birth had been planned and expected. Where is the father? Why is this Christian family conducting baptisms in secret? I know I should inquire, but the money is substantial, and my congregation's meeting house needs repairs. By the fourth baptism in 1857, Reverend Wells's journal revealed deeper suspicions. "I arrived at Hartwell property past midnight, as has become the terrible custom. This time I observed something I can no longer ignore. 2 of the enslaved men who assist in the household were present in the hallway outside the chamber where the baptism occurred. One of them, a tall, powerfully built man I believe is called Samuel, had tears streaming down his face as the infant was carried past. His expression was not that of a servant witnessing his master's family event. It was the face of a man in profound grief. The other man, slightly older, turned away quickly when I made eye contact, but not before I saw similar anguish in his features. Dear God, what am I party to? I begin to suspect the truth, and it is too horrible to write even in this private journal. If my suspicions are correct, then these children are born not just out of wedlock, but from unions that violate every law of God and society. But the laws of man are such that I cannot speak. To accuse a white woman of Congress with enslaved men would destroy her utterly, and the men themselves would face immediate execution. My silence protects no one, and damns everyone, including my own soul." After the 5th baptism in 1858, Reverend Wells wrote what may have been his most honest reflection. "I am a coward. I have sold my moral authority for money and the continued goodwill of the county's wealthiest family. Mrs. Constance has made subtle threats, never direct, always cloaked in pleasantries, about the unfortunate rumors that could circulate about ministers who misunderstand delicate family situations. I understand her meaning. If I speak publicly, she will destroy me. Her brother is the Attorney General. Her family financed the courthouse. Who would believe a simple minister against such power? The most disturbing aspect of Reverend Wells's journals was what he revealed about the children themselves. Unlike typical baptisms where infants were afterwards presented to family and community, these children seemed to disappear immediately after the ceremony. Reverend Wells noted that he never saw the same child twice. He was never invited to conduct dedication services, mark birthdays, or provide any follow-up spiritual guidance. The children were baptized and then vanished. After the sixth baptism in 1859, Reverend Wells attempted to ask directly about the children's welfare. His journal described a chilling response. I inquired of Mrs. Constance what had become of the previous infants, hoping to hear they were healthy and well. Her expression turned glacial. She informed me that the children were placed with appropriate families who could provide proper upbringing away from unfortunate circumstances. When I pressed gently for clarification, she ended the conversation abruptly and paid me less than previous occasions, a clear warning that further questions would not be tolerated. The seventh and final baptism occurred in January 1860. Reverend Wells's entry was brief and resigned. I am beyond salvation at this point. I have baptized 7 children born to an unmarried woman under circumstances I dare not speak aloud. I have taken money to maintain silence about what may be the most grievous sins occurring in this county. The tall enslaved man, Samuel, was present again, kept at a distance but clearly suffering. After the ceremony, as I departed, I heard a woman's scream from somewhere deep in the house. I did not investigate. I accepted my payment and fled into the night like the moral coward I have become. 1 month after this final baptism, something happened that would end the cycle of births and baptisms forever. Reverend Wells's journal contained a cryptic entry from February 1860. Word has reached me that there has been an unfortunate incident at Hartwell property. 3 of the house slaves have disappeared. Mrs. Constance visited me personally, the first time she has ever come to my residence, to inform me that my services will no longer be required for family matters. She paid me a final sum double what I received for any single baptism, along with a reminder that discretion remains a virtue, especially for men of the cloth who value their reputations. I understood. I am to forget everything I witnessed and pray God forgives us all. The Reverend never mentioned Hartwell property in his public sermons or official correspondence. His private journals, hidden away for 77 years after his death, were the only testimony that 7 children were born and baptized in secret, then erased from history as if their lives meant nothing. Chapter 6. The Disappearance. 850-950 words. The plantation inventory conducted in January 1860 listed 73 enslaved people at Hartwell property, each one documented with meticulous detail in Constance Hartwell's ledger. Names, approximate ages, physical characteristics, work assignments and monetary valuations. Samuel, age 35, valued at $1,500. Joshua, age 39, valued at $1,400. Martha, age 34, valued at $1,100. Rebecca, age 30, valued at $1,200. The 4 people who had stood beside Margaret in the 1853 photograph were all accounted for, listed under main house service, the most valuable category, reserved for enslaved people who worked directly under the family's supervision. By December 1860, a new inventory documented only 70 people. Samuel, Joshua, and Martha were gone. Their names simply did not appear. There were no notations of death, no records of sale to other plantations, no documentation of escape attempts. In the margin where their entries should have been, Constance had written only, "removed from service, no longer property of this estate." What happened to 3 of the 4 people photographed with Margaret in 1853? The question obsessed researchers once they recognized the correlation between the missing individuals and the cessation of Margaret's pregnancies. 7 children born between 1854 and 1860, with the last birth occurring in January 1860. 3 enslaved people disappearing from records in the same year. Margaret never pregnant again. The timing was too precise to be coincidental. The answer began to emerge from an unlikely source. A preserved letter written in 1863 by a Union Army officer who briefly occupied the county during a military campaign. Captain Thomas Henderson, a Massachusetts native horrified by his first direct exposure to slavery, wrote detailed letters to his wife describing what he witnessed. One letter, dated June 3, 1863, contained a passage that historians initially overlooked because it seemed like vague rumor rather than factual reporting. We have taken temporary headquarters in a county where the locals speak in whispers of a plantation where terrible things occurred before the war. The property belongs to a widow of considerable wealth who apparently fled when our forces approached. The enslaved people remaining on the property, we have liberated 37 souls, were reluctant to speak, even when assured of their freedom. But one elderly woman, emboldened by our promises of protection, told me a story so disturbing, I hesitate to commit it to paper. She claims that in early 1860, 3 people enslaved in the main house were taken away in the night. She heard screams. The next morning, the mistress of the plantation announced that the 3 had attempted escape and been dealt with according to law, but no sheriff was summoned. No notices appeared about captured runaways, and the elderly woman swears she saw fresh earth in a remote section of the property where the family cemetery is located, earth that had not been disturbed for years prior. She believes the 3 were killed and buried secretly to hide some shameful secret of the family. Captain Henderson concluded, I am uncertain whether to believe such tales. The old woman may be repeating gossip rather than facts. Yet there is genuine fear in her voice when she speaks of the widow and what happened in that house. I have ordered my men to conduct no investigation, as we lack jurisdiction over civilian matters, and my orders are to move forward with the campaign. But I confess the story troubles me deeply. This letter remained filed in Captain Henderson's personal papers, donated to a historical society in Massachusetts, where it sat unnoticed until a graduate student researching Union Army correspondence stumbled upon it in 2020. She recognized the description matched Hartwell property and immediately contacted researchers investigating the plantation's history. The elderly woman Captain Henderson interviewed was identified through cross-referencing with lists of freed people. Her name was Patience, age approximately 65 in 1863, who had worked at Hartwell property since childhood. Researchers attempted to trace her descendants through Freedmen's Bureau records but found she died in 1867, leaving no known children. Whatever she witnessed died with her, except for the fragment she shared with a Union officer during a brief moment of liberation. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted at the site of the former Hartwell plantation in 2021 revealed anomalies consistent with unmarked graves in the area of the private family cemetery. But legal complications prevented excavation. The land had been subdivided and sold multiple times since the Civil War, and current owners refused permission for archaeological investigation. Without exhumation and forensic analysis, definitive proof of what happened to Samuel, Joshua, and Martha remained impossible. However, additional evidence emerged from the most unlikely source, Margaret Hartwell herself. In 1894, 34 years after the disappearances, Margaret was admitted to a private asylum for nervous disorders and melancholia in Virginia. She died there in 1901, age 68, and her personal effects were eventually donated to a medical museum specializing in the history of psychiatric treatment. Among those effects was a small leather-bound journal, its pages mostly blank, except for a few entries written in a shaky, barely legible hand. One entry, undated but written in what handwriting analysts later determined was consistent with Margaret's late-period writing, contained a single devastating paragraph. Mother said they had to go away because of what happened. She said it was their fault. She said I would be ruined if anyone knew. She made me watch when they took S away first. She said I needed to understand consequences. I can still hear him screaming my name. J went quiet. M begged for her children. Mother showed no mercy. The ground swallowed them and no one came asking. No one ever comes asking. We are all damned and I welcome death as release from memory. If this account is accurate, Constance Hartwell had Samuel, Joshua, and Martha killed, not as punishment for escape attempts but to eliminate witnesses to what had occurred during her absences from the plantation. The 7 children born to Margaret were evidence of something that could destroy the family's reputation and social standing. By removing the enslaved men who might have been the biological fathers, and Martha, who may have known too much, Constance believed she could erase the truth. If this story has already captivated you, leave a like. It helps the story of Samuel, Joshua, and Martha reach more people. Chapter 7. The Children Who Vanished, 850-950 words. 7 children born between 1854 and 1860. 7 baptism certificates filed separately from normal records. 7 private midnight ceremonies performed by a reverend who was paid for his silence. And then, nothing. No subsequent records of these children's lives. No appearances in census data. No school enrollments, marriage certificates, or death records. They existed on paper for the brief moment of their births, then disappeared as completely as if they had never been born. Where did they go? This question became the central mystery for researchers investigating the Hartwell case. Initially, theories focused on the possibility that Constance had arranged for the children to be adopted by families elsewhere, perhaps relatives in distant states, or respectable families willing to raise children of uncertain parentage in exchange for financial compensation. Such arrangements were not unknown among wealthy Southern families dealing with illegitimate births, but investigation quickly revealed problems with this theory. Adoption in the antebellum South required legal documentation, even when informal. Children adopted across state lines appeared in the records of their destination states. Families who took in children from relatives typically acknowledged these arrangements in private correspondence, family Bibles, or inheritance documents. Despite exhaustive searches through archives in neighboring states, researchers found no trace of any children matching the ages and birth dates of Margaret's offspring, appearing in the records of families with Hartwell connections. The alternative explanation was far darker. The children had not been placed for adoption at all. They had been killed, either at birth or shortly afterward, to eliminate evidence of births that could destroy the Hartwell family's reputation. This possibility was so horrifying that researchers initially resisted considering it seriously, but as evidence accumulated, it became increasingly difficult to ignore. Dr. Edmund Price's medical journal provided the first major clue. In his entry about the third birth in 1857, he noted something unusual. The infant girl was healthy and strong, but Mrs. Constance insisted I depart immediately after delivery without providing instructions for newborn care. This violates all medical protocols. I attempted to explain that the mother requires guidance on nursing, that the child needs frequent feeding in the first hours. Mrs. Constance cut me off with cold fury, informed me my services were no longer required once the child was delivered and baptized, and had a servant escort me from the property. I have delivered hundreds of children, but never before been dismissed so quickly after birth. What happens to these infants after I leave? After the fifth birth in 1858, Dr. Price wrote something even more explicit. I am tormented by terrible suspicions. I have delivered 5 children to Miss Margaret over 4 years, yet I have never seen any of them again. A plantation of this size should have small children visible about the property, playing in yards, carried by nurses, appearing in family settings. But Hartwell property remains eerily quiet. No children's voices, no evidence of nurseries or toys. Where are they? I pray they have been sent to relatives for proper upbringing, but I fear something much worse. The Reverend's journals confirmed Dr. Price's observations. After the 4th baptism, Reverend Wells noted, "The infant I baptized tonight wore an elaborate white gown, clearly expensive and newly made. But Mrs. Constance held the child with no tenderness, no maternal warmth. The infant was a problem to be managed, not a grandchild to be celebrated. As I performed the sacrament, I found myself wondering if this child would survive to see morning." Physical evidence emerged from an unexpected source. A tin-type photograph discovered in 2020 in an antique shop in Charleston. The photograph, dated approximately 1858 based on technical analysis, showed the interior of what appeared to be Hartwell property's main parlor. The distinctive wallpaper pattern matched descriptions in estate inventories. In the background, partially visible, was a small white casket of the type used for infant burials. The casket was open but empty, and a woman's hand, visible only at the edge of the frame, held what appeared to be a small white burial gown. Researchers attempted to trace the photograph's provenance but discovered it had passed through multiple owners and auction houses over the decades. Its original context lost. The antique shop owner had purchased it as part of a lot of miscellaneous Southern antebellum photographs, and had no information about where it originated, but the wallpaper pattern was distinctive enough to make confident attribution to Hartwell property, and the date range matched the period when Margaret's children were being born. The most damning evidence came from Hartwell family correspondence discovered in an archive of South Carolina planter papers. A letter written by Constance Hartwell to her brother, the Attorney General, in March 1857, contained a veiled reference that took on sinister meaning in light of other evidence. The situation we discussed has been resolved with appropriate discretion. The family's reputation remains untarnished. I have ensured no permanent complications will arise from the unfortunate circumstances. Your advice regarding the handling of evidence was most useful. All records have been managed in accordance with your recommendations. We need speak no more of this matter. The Attorney General's reply, dated 2 weeks later, was even more explicit. I am relieved that you have taken necessary measures. In such situations, immediate action is essential. Better to resolve problems decisively than to allow them to grow into public scandals. I trust you have been thorough in eliminating all traces. Should questions arise, I am prepared to use my authority to redirect inquiries. What necessary measures had Constance taken? What evidence had been handled? The language suggested something far beyond simply arranging adoptions. It suggested elimination, the permanent removal of children whose very existence threatened family honor. Ground surveys of Hartwell property revealed another disturbing detail. The private family cemetery contained 11 marked graves: Thomas Hartwell, his parents, Constance's parents, and 5 children who had died in infancy before Margaret's birth. But the cemetery covered a half-acre plot, and only a small section contained marked stones. The remainder was overgrown but showed signs of ground disturbance consistent with unmarked burials. In 2022, researchers petitioned for permission to conduct limited archaeological investigation of the unmarked sections of the cemetery. The current landowner initially agreed but withdrew permission after receiving threatening letters from individuals claiming descent from the Hartwell family, who insisted that disturbing ancestral graves was disrespectful and unnecessary. Legal battles over access to the site continued as of 2024, with no resolution in sight. Without excavation and forensic analysis, absolute proof of what happened to Margaret's 7 children remained elusive, but the accumulated evidence pointed to a terrible conclusion. The children were killed, probably soon after birth, to eliminate evidence of births that would have destroyed the Hartwell family's social position. In a society where white women's sexual purity was considered sacred, and where any suggestion of interracial contact was grounds for complete social destruction, Constance had decided that murdering her own grandchildren was preferable to admitting the truth of how they were conceived. 7 innocent lives, snuffed out before they could speak or be seen, buried in unmarked graves where no one would ask questions. 7 victims of a system so brutal and dehumanizing that it made infanticide seem like a rational choice to protect family reputation. Chapter 8. Constance's Final Years. 850, 950 words. When Union forces approached South Carolina in early 1865, Constance Hartwell did what many wealthy Southerners did. She fled, but unlike most who abandoned their plantations in panic, taking only what they could carry, Constance executed a methodical withdrawal that suggested careful planning. According to testimony later provided by enslaved people who were freed when the Union Army arrived, Constance spent weeks burning documents, destroying records, and removing valuables from the property. She departed in April 1865 with 2 wagons filled with trunks, traveling north with an escort of 3 white men whose identities were never recorded. She never returned to Hartwell property. After the war, the plantation was seized for unpaid taxes and eventually subdivided and sold to multiple buyers. The main house stood vacant for years, fell into disrepair, and was finally demolished in 1891. The land that had been the site of so much suffering was transformed into small farms, worked by formerly enslaved people who purchased parcels through Freedmen's Bureau programs. But where did Constance go? The question remained unanswered for over 150 years, until researchers in 2021 discovered a lead in an unexpected place: property records from Richmond, Virginia. In July 1865, a woman named C. Hartwell purchased a townhouse in a quiet residential district, paying in gold, unusual in a time when Confederate currency was worthless and even Union money was scarce. The purchase was handled through a lawyer with no direct connection to the buyer, a common technique for people who wanted to remain anonymous. Constance lived in Richmond for 17 years, dying in 1882 at age 85. She maintained a small household with 2 servants, both white women, notably not black workers. She had no social life to speak of, never attended church services, and appeared in no local society records. Her neighbors, questioned decades later by a local historian compiling biographical sketches of Richmond residents, remembered her as an extremely private elderly woman who rarely left her house and spoke to no one. The townhouse itself revealed Constance's final years were marked by isolation and perhaps paranoia. When the property was sold after her death, the executor's inventory noted that Constance had installed multiple locks on every door, bars on windows, and thick curtains that blocked all views into the residence. She kept no personal correspondence, no family photographs, no memorabilia from her previous life in South Carolina. It was as if she had deliberately erased her own past. Constance's will, probated in Richmond in 1883, was remarkably brief. She left her remaining assets, approximately $8,000, a substantial sum for the era, to a Catholic orphanage in Baltimore, with the explicit condition that the money be used to support children whose parentage is unknown or irregular. The choice of beneficiary was striking. Constance was raised Presbyterian, not Catholic, and had no known connection to Baltimore. The condition about children of unknown parentage seemed either deeply ironic or perhaps represented some late-life attempt at redemption for what she had done to her own grandchildren. What happened to Margaret during these years? Researchers discovered that she did not accompany her mother to Richmond. Instead, in November 1865, she was admitted to the Virginia State Lunatic Asylum under the name M. Hartwell, with legal commitment papers signed by Constance as her legal guardian. The commitment paperwork listed Margaret's condition as severe melancholia and moral insanity, and noted that she was subject to violent delusions and uncontrollable emotional episodes. The asylum records, preserved in the Virginia State Archives, painted a portrait of a woman completely broken by what she had endured. Margaret spent 36 years in that institution, from age 32 until her death at age 68 in 1901. Staff notes described her as generally docile and withdrawn, spending most of her time sitting motionless by a window, staring at nothing. She rarely spoke, and when she did, her words made little sense to the staff. Fragmentary references to the ones who were taken and mother's solution. Only once did Margaret experience what staff described as a violent episode. In 1878, during a visit from a Baptist missionary who regularly came to the asylum to offer spiritual comfort to patients, Margaret suddenly grabbed the missionary's hands and began speaking rapidly in a clear, urgent voice. A staff member present recorded her words in the incident report. She confessed to me that she had been forced to bear children against her will, that her mother had arranged everything, that the children were taken from her immediately after birth, and that she believed they were murdered. She claimed she could hear them crying at night. The patient became so agitated we had to administer sedatives. The missionary reported the incident to asylum administrators, suggesting that if Margaret's claims were true, authorities should investigate. But the administrator dismissed the story as the ramblings of an insane woman and warned the missionary not to spread malicious rumors based on a mad woman's delusions. No investigation occurred. The missionary never returned to visit Margaret. Margaret's personal effects, preserved by the asylum and eventually donated to a medical museum, revealed the inner life of a woman who never escaped her trauma. The small leather journal containing her confession about watching Samuel, Joshua, and Martha being taken away was not the only evidence of her torment. She had also produced dozens of crude drawings on scraps of paper, images of children always drawn without faces surrounded by darkness. Some drawings showed a large figure, presumably Constance, hovering over small forms. Others showed graves marked with crosses. One drawing was particularly haunting. It depicted a woman, presumably Margaret herself, standing at a window, with 7 small ghostly figures visible outside in the darkness, their arms reaching toward her. At the bottom of the drawing, in shaky handwriting, she had written, "They come to me every night. They ask why I did not save them. I have no answer." Margaret died in 1901 from pneumonia. She was buried in the asylum cemetery in an unmarked grave, one of hundreds of patients who died without family to claim their bodies or provide proper burials. It took researchers until 2023 to identify which unmarked grave was hers, using asylum burial records cross-referenced with death certificates. A small memorial stone was placed there in 2024, funded by donations from people who learned her story. Margaret Hartwell, 1833-1901, victim of a system that destroyed her.